Let me start with this Core 13 Unit 1. The topic is post-colonialism. If you talk about that post-colonialism, it is the study of whom? Colonization, right? And that colonization which affected countries, and how they have changed after gaining independence. So when you talk about indicating nothing but the freedom that the country has received after colonization, right? So that is what known as a post-colonization. So when you talk about colonization means colony, right? Colony. You find out that Britishers whose main aim and also main thought is to nothing but occupy a particular country or particular kingdom and try to fetch all such kind of benefits or the advantages that they receive from the kingdom or the country, isn't it? So that is what you known as a colonization, and post-colonization is called as how that kingdom and the country get the freedom from those Britishers, isn't it? So it looks like at the impact of colonial rule on culture, politics, and society, right? Three of the things that's called as a culture, politics, and society. So you can find out that when we talk about post-colonialization, so we generally talk about freedom and identity. Freedom and identity, that how people rebuild their identity after being ruled by others, right? Second, it's called the mix of cultures. When we talk about mix of cultures, it means we talk about how colonial and native cultures, combine to create something new, isn't it? So, and the third one, you can talk about voices of the oppressed. What do you mean by oppressed? Oppressed means called as a people who get who tortured others, isn't it? So, or people who are tortured. The oppressed is generally indicating that the people who were ruled by the Britishers, isn't it? So, and we will, when we talk about voices of the oppressed, it means we are going to hear the stories of those of the people who were ruled, right? Then the fourth one is called as the effects of colonization. So, what is the effect of colonization? We can say that what understanding how colonial rule still influence countries today, isn't it? So let's talk about India, where you find out how the Britishers ruled the country for 200 years, and after means, India got its freedom or independence, means what kind of change in the culture, society, and politics, isn't it? Still, we follow some kind of things like Western culture, right? And we live in the kind of a society where we have thoughts and imagination which are nothing but called as a purely British culture or British thoughts and society and politics. Politics also we follow the kind of politics Britishers played to the country. The same also we find out in the Indian politics, isn't it? And that's what it's called as a post-colonialism. Helps us to see how history shapes the present and how former colonies continue to deal with the effects of the past. Right? So coming to the topic, uh, that's what we are going to discuss. When we talk about this post-colonialism, we generally observe a couple of things that called it what are the objectives and uh, the introduction to colonialism, and we also talk about post-colonialism. And beside that, we will see also some of the things like when we talk about objectives, we find out means introduction to colonialism, how the colonialism uh, had been introduced, and we will also discuss the types of modes of colonialism. So different ways through which colonialism ruled the country or a kingdom. So, and we'll also understand the importance of post-colonialism. So, beside that, we will also discuss some of the concept of decolonization. So, let's come to the first one, introduction to colonialism, in which you will find out during the 15th and 16th century, 15th and 16th centuries, European countries focused on logical, rational, and optimal use of resources to maximize their profits. Isn't it? Like, because we understood that for the European countries, right? So what their focus is to derive all those natural resources. Uh, so natural resources to do what? To get the maximum profit. As capitalism, what do you mean by capitalism? We talk about wealthy, right? Wealth. So wealthful or capitalism flourished as wealth that you find out wealth that gain excessively. So you find out efficiency and profitability became closely linked. Efficiency means what? That called as a ability to fetch more, and also profitability. They also find out when they get the rational and optimal use of resources. They find out that the wealth is gaining a lot. Second, it's called as they find out the ability and the profitability. So what they thought here that they all are linked together. So what are the things linked together? Resources, natural resources, efficiency, profitability, and wealth. All are linked together. So by the 17th century, what happened with the beginning of the industrial revolution? When did it introduce? 17th century, right? Or when did it begin? 17th century. So you find out 15th and 16th century, which is nothing but the beginning period where European countries found out all kind of links. 17th century industrial revolution occurred. European nations, they wanted what? The European nations, they wanted labor and raw, right? So raw materials. So, and where do they get it? They get it outside Europe, right? So, and this led to the journey. This led to the journey of discovery and the colonization of regions in where? Asia, Africa, and South America. Did you get? Now, what have you drawn out of this? You have drawn that nothing but how colonization started, right? We've understood it started 15th century, 17th, they found out nothing but the industrial revolution. And for the industrial revolution, what they needed labor and raw materials. And for those labor and raw materials, they started doing the journey. And when they did the journey, so what happened? They started the colonization of the regions. What are the regions that means included in the colonization? Asia, Africa, and South America, isn't it? So these regions provided the necessary resources. What kind of resources? Labor and raw materials, right? And also served as markets for European goods. So colonialism operated on a center-periphery model. Colonialism means operated on a center-periphery model where the colonizing power becomes the center, and that sets the standards in what? Culture, language, and governance. When we talk about culture, we understand the kind of a culture Britishers have or called as colonizers have. And second, it's called the language, which may be English, which may be French, or which may be whatever the language they do have, they try to impose, right? And the third one is called the governance. Whatever the kind of a ruling they do have, they also impose the same. While the colonies, the periphery, right? That were expected to that were expected to what? Imitate them. When you talk about that, what? Colonizing power become the center. And when you say colonies become the periphery, who were expected to imitate them. Like, I'm the ruler, and you are ruled. I'm the ruler, you are the ruled. And what my center is called as a means governance, and your center is called as imitate that governance. Imitate means copy, right? Copy that governance. So what happened here, which were European center, where they were processed into finished goods. So the system involved in a two-way trade dynamic. The system is what kind of a system? We talk about colonizing power, and secondly, it's called the colonies. And here you would find out the system involved in a two-trade dynamic. Two-trade dynamic. Raw materials were extracted, where raw materials were extracted from the colonies and sent to the European center, isn't it? And where they were processed into finished goods. Did you get the point? So, which were then marketed back to the colonies, isn't it? This makes sure that the colonies remained economically dependent on the center, right? So, in that case, very simple example, you can say that a country called England, right, or Britain. So, what did they do? They ruled India. They faced the what you can say that natural resources. So they made it fine, and they make it good, and they send it to Britain, isn't it? So in Britain they were sold, even things also taken from India went to Britain, and then you would find out that there it was sold, and also it brought back to India again, and when it came to India, it was sold in a high prices, isn't it? Talk about the product called Levi's, isn't it? You find out the cost of that clothes and garments is huge, isn't it? Peter England, you talk about Total, some kind of a brand which would be high, Jack and Jones, isn't it? So that is why you can say this made sure that the colonies remained economically dependent on the center. Center means colonialism. So when we talk about post-colonialism challenges the hierarchical model. Hierarchical model means what? Called as a gradation. Hierarchical means gradation. So post-colonialism challenges the gradation model. It questions the dominance of the center and desires to, dismantle, you can say. Desires to dismantle or break the binary distinction between the colonizer and the colonized. Colonizer and colonized. So in that case, decolonization in this context, decolonization is called as a no rule, right? Decolonization or called as a limited rule. In this context, refers to the what process of not doing colonial rule and its ideological structure. So decolonization indicating that you shall not focus on you shall not do the colonial rule or British rule, and also you shall not follow the set of ideas that the colonials have, right? So you cannot implement that. That is what the decolonization, or you can say that post-colonialism, isn't it? Now, when we talk about post-colonialism, so the term post-colonial, so first appeared in a historical discourse or historical debate following World War II, right? Initially serving as a chronological marker indicating the degrading of colonialism in the 1950s. So, however, if you talk about the scholars in cultural studies, so latter argued that post-colonialism does not merely signify the end of colonial rule. Post-colonialism does not signify the what? Merely or only signify the end of colonialism. So you can say that what post-colonialism came out, right? Or called as most of the countries got the freedom from the colonials. It means we can say that after getting freedom from the post-colonialism, so the colonial rule was stopped. No, it was not. But you can say that what it becomes or it marks the continuation of colonial influence. Colonial influence in different terms. Let's say that in a family, what our parents teach us the kind of values that may be cultural, that may be called as a social, that may be called as a political value. Even after death, also we follow that, isn't it? So similar to that, or simultaneously, you could say that the colonial influences are there in different terms, right? So cultural studies scholars differentiate between what pre-colonial and post-colonial, pre-colonial and post-colonial what eras, right? So, for instance, the establishment of the first British factory, where did it occur and when did it occur? It was in Surat and in 1600. That marks the beginning of British colonialism in India, isn't it? So, therefore, the pre-1600 period is known as a colonized pre-colonial, colonialized pre-colonial. So, at the same time, while everything after it is known as a post-colonial, right, reflecting the continued impact of colonial rule, even after formal independence, even after formal independence, various forms of colonial control persist or continues, including economic, political, and cultural domination. Scholars argue that while political colonialism may have ended, economic colonialism has taken its place. So the most visible effects of colonialism are seen when or where seen in you can say that cultural influences that continues long after independence, right? The next, you could say that types and models of decolonization. Types and models of what? Colonization, right? So when we talk about types and models of colonization, we can find out there are different types of colonies. You can say two types of colonies. One is called as a settler, and the second one is called as invaded colonies, right? Settler colonies and invaded colonies. Now, in settler colonies, what happened? Now, it consists. Settler means what? Permanently. So they consist, or they these colonists settled permanently. So where did they settle? They settled in Australia. They settled in Canada. They settled in New Zealand, isn't it? These are the places where colonies are settled. Second is called the invaded colonies. Invaded means called as a division, right? Separation. So where you can say colonizers are separated, but finally they left. Separated, but finally they left. You can say India, Africa, the Caribbean. Now they came to India. They separated India into two parts that called as India and Pakistan, right? So you also find out Africa. You also find out the Caribbean, isn't it? So these are known as the invaded colonies. Got the point? Then, if you talk about their types, we also discuss about the models, right? Models of colonization. Let's say that what kind of a models of colonization? You can say British model, right? And second one is called as a French model. So British model is nothing but an indirect rule, in which you would find out the colonizer ruled through local representation, isn't it? So second is called as they interfere minimal intervention in local cultures and religious practices. And third is called as authority was maintained without direct control, right? So that is nothing but the three parts or three indirect rules Britishers have. But when you talk about French model rule, we find out that they do have nothing but an assimilation policy, right? So what is that assimilation policy? First, it's called as the colonized people were expected to what? Adapt. Adapt to what? French identity and French culture. Assimilation means together, isn't it? Like my language, my culture, my style, my product, everything you acquire. Yes. So adapt. So that is known as a French culture or French model. So the colonized people were expected to adapt what French identity and culture. Second is called the French citizenship. French citizenship was extended to colonial subjects, right? So third is called as this approach faced what the resistance as what people wanted to preserve their native identities, isn't it? Now, obviously, means I do have my own identity. Why shall I acquire yours? Right. So we have such an ideology. Why do we follow yours? Isn't it? Now, when you are trying to impose that, when you are trying to force it, so at the same time, what happened? I try to resist it. I try to stop that, isn't it? So that is what the nature of decolonization means, dependent on what the colonization model, isn't it? British decolonization was largely constitutional and gradual, whereas means French decolonization was often violent and you can say marked by conflicts. So one, Britishers are nothing but followed with the rule, logic, means constitutional and gradual. Whereas French is nothing but what the decolonization was often violent and marked by conflicts. Did you get that? Understood? Now, the next is called as a colonialism as a form of imperialism. Colonialism as a form of imperialism, right? So, when we talk about imperialism, that displays in three major aspects. One is called as a geographical, second is called as a political, and the third one is called as a economic. Economic. So, geographical, political, and economic. If I talk about geographical, what do we find out? The expansion of a state. The expansion of state power through territorial acquisition, right? What do you mean by territorial acquisition? That called as a part of the land acquired or land acquired, isn't it? So territorial. So in that case, the expansion of state power through territorial acquired. Second is called as a political, obviously the subjugation of people under foreign rule. So whatever the colonial rule, so when the people come under it, people subjugation. Subjugation means whatever the rule is directed, you have to follow that, isn't it? And the third one is called as economic, in which we find out the exploitation of resources and labor for financial benefit, isn't it? So therefore, it is known as a geographical. Second is called as a political, and third one is called as a economic. These three things are mainly means considering as a followed by the colonizers towards the colonized, isn't it? And that is known as a imperialism, right? Ruling. So you can say that imperialism has existed throughout the history, but became particularly pronounced between 1890 and 1914, right? So known as the what age of imperialism. So please mark it. Age of imperialism is known as the 1890 and 1914, right? And means imperialism held under this three parts. One is geographical, economical, and political. So European parts competed to acquire what colonies. So particularly in Africa, justifications for imperialism included what the idea of white man's burden. White man's burden, a term popularized by whom? Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling. Who is Rudyard Kipling? One of the writers, right? One of the poet. So who means made nothing but what? One of the justification in his writing that called as a white man's burden. So which framed colonization as a moral duty to civilized non-European societies. So after World War One, imperialism merged with what? Fascism. Imperialism merged with whom? Fascism and Nazism. Do you understand fascism and Nazism? So again, you are talking about despotism or called as absolutism, right? So where autocratic nature, Nazism is called as a belief in Nazi culture, right? So the first comprehensive economic study of modern imperialism, The first comprehensive understanding economic study of modern imperialism was J.A. Hobson's. J.A. Hobson's what? Imperialism, which was written in the year of 1902. So, followed by Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism in the year of 1950. So, these books argue what? These books argue that imperialism was a mechanism. Ruling was nothing but a kind of a mechanism, right? A kind of a system. So, of monopolistic capitalism, right? Monopolistic, you understand? Mono means one. Mono means one. Capitalist is called as, monopolistic. So, mono means one. Polistic is called as one person who ruled. Monopoly, we say monopolistic. So, one person who ruled on his or her own ways to the people. That is what known as a monopolistic. हाँ ma'am. हाँ ସେ କୋଉଥିରେ ଦବ କି କୋଉଥିରେ ଦଉଛନ୍ତି ଆଜ୍ଞା So in that case, you can point out which argued that what imperialism was a mechanism of what monopolistic capitalism. When we talk about monopolistic capitalism, it means one person who is rich, one person who has absolute authority, right? Absolute authority over others, right? So in this case, capitalism, according to Lenin, capitalism means what? Believe on means you can say wealth. Right. So, according to Lenin, leads to the what? Accumulation of wealth. Accumulation means for gathering money. So, among a few powerful individuals and the nation, ultimately doing what? Reducing purchasing power and fostering monopolies. Right. So, what happened if you have money? What do? You buy power. You buy power, and also means. You find out that you can do whatever you want to. That's what absolutism or means monopolistic nature. So wealthy nation then invest in what are politically in unstable areas, gradually taking control of their economies and also governments. Right, a process that fuels nothing but a colonialism, isn't it? So imperialism surely leads to war because of the such kind of a rule. What happened? It leads to war. So, as competing imperial powers struggle for dominance, Lenin described what? Now, imperialism as a self-destructive system. Imperialism is what? As a self-destructive power, right, or system, and that leads to revolutions against both capitalism and colonial rule, isn't it? I'll take care of you. Let me complete that after that. So now we'll understand all such kind of things. Now let's move to the next one. It's called as a colonialism and its effects. Right. When we talk about colonialism and its effects, what do we find out? Basically, if you say colonialism is on two primary distinctions. Right. One is called as the racial differences. Second one is called as the economic dependence. So racial difference is what? A street separation, street tight or called as a strong separation between the colonizer and colonized. And Rudyard Kipling famously wrote that what? The East is the East, the West is West, and the two shall never meet. Never meet, isn't it? So that is called as a kind of a difference between racial difference. Second, it's called as economic dependence. When we talk about economic dependence, we stated about colonies were, structured to supply raw materials while the metropole, or called as a metropole means colonized country or colonizing country, produced finished goods, isn't it? So this left colonies what? Economically dependent. Economically dependent on whom? Dependent on their colonial roots, isn't it? So before colonial rule, what happened? India contributed 18% of the world economy. By the end of colonialism, what happened? The figure had dropped to just 2%. Isn't it? Why did it so? Now, because of the contribution that the colonials given, isn't it? So that is why. Now, finally, when we reach to the end of it, we understand that the colonialism involved what? Involves the forced subjugation for a country or territory, depriving or called making most of the people escape it of a political and economic autonomy. So colonies serve as a what? A sources of colonies, yeah, serve as a source of what? Raw materials, markets for manufactured goods, and investment zones for the colonizing powers. And this one-sided economic structure that results in what? Exploitation and dependence. Second, by the late 19th and early 20th century, nearly 90% of the world was under colonial rule. So, however, following World War II, you would find out colonial power weakened and movements for independence gained momentum. So, the rise of the USA, the USSR, right? So, as a global superpowers, further challenged colonial dominance. The year 1947 marked an important turning point in the history of decolonization, right? Symbolized by India gaining independence through non-violence, resistance. Third is called as while political colonialism has largely ended. So the lingering effects of economic and cultural colonialism uh, continue to shape post-colonial societies. Understanding post-colonialism helps you in what? Critically analyzing the ongoing impacts of colonial history or histories and the efforts of reclaimed cultural and economic rule or sovereignty. So that's what the first part of it. And I think you have two more parts of this particular topic, which we will discuss tomorrow. Fine?